my parents repeated. This is fair and final, while explaining why everything was being divided without me. I accepted it without emotion. Later, when ownership was questioned in front of extended family and no one could answer clearly, I knew silence had done its work. I should probably explain. My name is Madeline. I am 32 years old. I grew up in a small river town in Missouri, the kind of place where everyone knows whose grandfather built which house and whose grandmother is buried in the cemetery by the old Lutheran church. My family lived in a white Victorian on Sycamore Street for 4 generations. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. At least I thought it was. I was the eldest of 3 children. My brother Aaron came 2 years after me. My sister Julia came 4 years after that. By the time we were all grown, Aaron had moved to Denver for a tech job. Julia married young and settled in Kansas City, close enough to visit but far enough to avoid obligations. And I stayed. I stayed because someone had to. If you have ever been the one who stayed, you already know what that means. If you have not, let me paint the picture. When my mother got sick, I was 24. She was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's, complicated by a heart condition no one caught until it was already embedded deep. My father, who had spent his whole life working as a surveyor for the county, did not know how to care for her. He tried, but his hands were built for measuring land, not adjusting feeding tubes. So I moved back home. I told myself it would be temporary, just a few months while we figured things out, just until Aaron could take some time off, just until Julia's kids were old enough for her to help more. Those months turned into years, 8 of them, to be exact. I bathed my mother when she could no longer stand. I turned her every 2 hours during the nights when bed sores threatened. I learned the names of every medication, every dosage, every interaction. I coordinated with hospice. I filled out insurance forms. I argued with the pharmacy when they sent the wrong prescription. I did all of this while working part-time as a legal assistant at a small firm downtown. I learned things there too. How to read contracts. How to spot a clause meant to bury someone. How to recognize when a document says one thing but means another. That job kept me sane. It also, eventually, saved me. My siblings visited. I want to be fair about that. Aaron came for Thanksgiving most years. Julia came when there was a birthday or a crisis. They sent flowers. They called on Sundays. They told me I was doing a good job. They told me they did not know how I managed. They told me they wished they could do more, but they did not do more. They just wished. If you are watching this and you have seen something like this in your own family, let me know in the comments what city you are watching from. I spent a long time thinking this only happened to me, that I was somehow uniquely unlucky. But the more I talk about it, the more I realize this story is not rare. It is just rarely told by the person who stayed. My mother passed on a Tuesday in March. She was 61 years old. I was holding her hand when it happened. My father was asleep in the next room. Aaron was on a plane that landed 2 hours too late. Julia was driving and missed the last call I made. I do not hold that against them. Death does not wait for convenient timing. But I remember it. I remember being the only one in the room when her breathing changed. I remember the silence after. I remember walking out to the kitchen and making coffee because I did not know what else to do. The funeral was simple. My mother had planned most of it herself, years before, in a binder she kept in the hall closet. She had written down the hymns she wanted, the readings, the flowers. I followed her instructions to the letter because that is what I had been doing for 8 years, and I did not know how to stop. After the burial, we gathered at the house. Extended family filled the living room. Casseroles covered every counter. My father sat in his recliner and accepted condolences, like a man watching the world from behind glass. Aaron shook hands. Julia cried. I refilled coffee cups and washed dishes and made sure no one left their coat behind. 3 weeks later, my father called a family meeting. He sat us down in the living room, the same room where my mother had taken her last breath, and explained that he had been thinking about the future. He said that at his age, with his health beginning to decline, it made sense to start planning now to avoid complications later, to make sure everything was handled cleanly. I nodded. I thought he was being responsible. I thought he was going to ask for help. Instead, he handed Aaron and Julia a folder each. Inside were legal documents, titles, transfers. The house, he explained, would go to Aaron. The savings accounts and investments would be split between Aaron and Julia. The car, the land out by the county line, the small rental property my grandfather had left behind. All of it would be divided between my two siblings. I asked where my folder was. My father looked at me with something I still cannot name. Not cruelty. Exactly. Not even coldness. More like he had already decided the answer and did not understand why I was asking the question. He said, "Madeline, you have been living here rent-free for years. You have had stability. A home, that was your share." I waited for him to laugh, to correct himself, to say he had misspoken. He did not. Julia shifted in her seat. Aaron stared at the floor. Neither of them said a word. My father continued. He said this was fair. He said this was final. He said he had spoken with a lawyer and everything was in order. He said he hoped I understood. I did not understand. But I nodded anyway. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I want you to imagine spending 8 years of your life caring for someone you loved, watching your career stall, your friendships fade, your 20s disappear into a blur of hospital beds and insurance calls, and then being told that your compensation was the privilege of being allowed to stay. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply nodded and said, "Okay." And that, I think, is when they decided I had accepted it, that I had agreed, that my silence meant consent. It did not. My silence meant I was calculating. In the weeks that followed, I continued living in the house. Not in my old bedroom, which Julia had claimed for storage when she came to visit. I stayed in the guest room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that stuck and the radiator that clanged at night. I paid for my own groceries. I kept to myself. I watched. Aaron flew back to Denver. Julia returned to Kansas City. My father resumed his routine of reading the newspaper in the morning and watching television at night. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not thank me for staying. He treated me like furniture. Necessary, perhaps, but not worth noticing. I began gathering documents. Not dramatically, not with intention at first. I just started organizing the papers my mother had left behind. The binder in the closet led to boxes in the attic. The boxes led to file cabinets in the basement. I told myself I was just cleaning, just sorting, just making sense of the mess. But the more I looked, the more I found. I found receipts for property taxes. I had paid out of my own pocket when my father forgot. I found utility bills with my name on the account. I found the durable power of attorney my mother had signed 6 years earlier, naming me as her legal representative in all matters of health and property. I found emails between my father and his lawyer, forwarded to me by accident, discussing how to simplify the estate and avoid unnecessary disputes. I was the unnecessary dispute. One night, I sat on the floor of the basement, surrounded by paper, and I almost stopped. I almost closed the boxes, almost shoved the files back into their drawers, almost convinced myself that none of it mattered, that the house was just a building, that the money was just numbers, that my father was old and grieving, and maybe, just maybe, I was being unfair. I thought about deleting the emails, walking away, starting over somewhere new, somewhere no one knew my name or my story. I thought about how easy it would be to disappear, to let them have their version of events, to let the lie win. I had the cursor hovering over the delete button for almost a full minute. And then I saw the date on one of the documents. It was a transfer of title, moving the house into Aaron's name. The date was March 3rd. My mother died on March 7th. 4 days. They had started dividing the estate 4 days before she was even gone. I closed my laptop. I did not delete anything. I saved every file to 3 separate locations. I printed copies. I organized them by date, by type, by relevance. I worked slowly, carefully, like a woman who had learned that rushing led to mistakes. And then I waited. The opportunity came 7 months later, at a family reunion hosted by my father's sister, my Aunt Caroline. She was turning 70 and had rented out the back room of a restaurant in town. Extended family came from as far as Nebraska. Cousins I had not seen in years. Uncles who still remembered me as a child. I wore a simple dress. I smiled when spoken to. I helped set up the tables and arrange the flowers. I was invisible in the way I had always been invisible. Halfway through the event, my cousin Daniel asked a simple question. He had been talking to Aaron about real estate, about investments, about the market, and then he said, "So the old house on Sycamore, that is still in your parents' name, right? Your dad mentioned something about holding on to it for sentimental reasons." Aaron hesitated. Julia, standing nearby, looked at her drink. My father, seated at a table across the room, suddenly became very interested in his napkin. Daniel looked around, confused. Wait, did I say something wrong? And that is when Aunt Caroline, bless her heart, said, I thought Madeline was handling the house. She is the one who has been living there, is she not? She is the one who took care of your mother. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that has weight. The kind that makes everyone in the room aware that something has shifted. Aaron started to explain. Julia interrupted. My father said nothing at all, and in the confusion, in the overlapping voices and half-finished sentences, one thing became very clear. No one could answer the question. No one could explain, in front of family, in front of witnesses, why the daughter who had given up 8 years of her life was not listed on a single document. No one could justify it without sounding exactly like what they were. I did not say a word. I just stood by the dessert table, holding a glass of water, and watched. I could have spoken then. I could have laid out the evidence, explained the timeline, revealed the emails. I could have made a scene. But I did not. I wanted them to sit in that silence. I wanted them to feel what I had felt for months. The weight of a question no one wants to answer. After the reunion, things changed. Slowly at first. Aunt Caroline called me the next week to ask if I was okay. A cousin sent me a message saying she had always thought I was the responsible one. My father stopped making eye contact when I walked through the room. And then came the letter from Aaron. He wrote to say that he and Julia had been talking, that they realized things might have been handled poorly, that they wanted to offer me a small settlement, a token of appreciation for my years of caregiving. He proposed $10,000. $10,000 for 8 years. I did the math. That is approximately $3.42 per day. I did not respond. Now, I want to pause here, because I know what some of you might be thinking. Maybe my father was just scared. Maybe he was grieving and not thinking clearly. Maybe Aaron and Julia did not know the full extent of what had happened. Maybe, in their own way, they thought they were being fair. And you know what? Maybe some of that is true. My father did love my mother. He cried at her funeral. He kept her photo on the mantle. He was not a monster. He was just a man who had always found it easier to look at spreadsheets than at people. A man who measured his love in things you could count. And Aaron and Julia were not villains. They were just people who had learned a long time ago that staying away meant staying comfortable. They did not ask questions because the answers might have required something of them. I do not think they set out to hurt me. I think they set out to protect themselves, and in the arithmetic of self-preservation, I simply did not factor. But here is what I learned. Intent does not undo impact. Ignorance does not erase consequence. And love that only shows up when it is convenient is not love. It is convenience. If this story is resonating with you, if you are still here, maybe consider hitting the like button. It helps more than you know. Stories like this one do not get told very often, and every bit of visibility matters. I began filing paperwork 3 months after the reunion. I did not sue. That is important. I did not take them to court. I did not hire a lawyer to send threatening letters. I did not scream or accuse or demand. I simply filed a quiet title action. For those who do not know, a quiet title action is a legal process used to establish ownership of property when there is a dispute or a cloud on the title. It is not aggressive. It is not dramatic. It is just a formal way of asking a court to look at the evidence and determine who actually owns what. And I had evidence. I had the durable power of attorney my mother had signed, granting me authority over property decisions during her incapacity. I had the receipts showing I had paid property taxes for 6 of the 8 years I lived in that house. I had utility bills and maintenance records, and a paper trail showing that I had been the de facto manager of the property for nearly a decade. I had the emails showing that the transfer had been initiated before my mother died, while she was still legally incapacitated, without my knowledge or consent. The process took 11 months. 11 months of waiting rooms and notarized documents and court dates scheduled and rescheduled. 11 months of not telling anyone what I was doing. 11 months of quiet, careful, patient work. My father passed away 8 months in, a stroke, sudden and swift. I was not at his bedside. I do not know if he asked for me. At his funeral, Aaron and Julia stood at the front of the room and talked about what a devoted family man he had been, how he had always put his children first, how he had worked so hard to give them a stable foundation. I sat in the back row and said nothing. 2 months after the funeral, the court issued its ruling. The transfer of the house to Aaron was declared invalid. The power of attorney had never been properly revoked. The taxes I had paid established a continuous claim. The lack of notification or compensation for my years of caregiving was deemed a failure of fiduciary responsibility. The house on Sycamore Street was mine. Not shared, not divided, not held in trust. Mine, solely and completely. I received the official notice on a Wednesday afternoon. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood, and then I sat down on the floor of the guest room, the room with the stuck window and the clanging radiator, and I cried for the first time in years. Not because I was happy, not exactly, but because it was over, because I had spent so long carrying something that was never mine to carry, and now I could finally set it down. I did not call Aaron. I did not call Julia. I did not make any announcements. I let the court notify them. I let the paperwork speak for itself. I let them find out the same way I had found out about their inheritance, through official channels, without warning, without the chance to argue. When Aaron finally called, his voice was shaking. He asked how I could do this. He asked if I had any idea what this meant for his finances, for his plans. He said he had been counting on selling that house. He said I had ruined everything. I listened until he finished. And then I said, I was never trying to ruin anything. I was just trying to be included. He hung up without responding. Julia sent a long email a few days later. She said I had always been difficult, that I had never understood how hard it was for her, being the youngest, always living in my shadow, that our father had tried his best, that I should be ashamed of myself. I did not reply. Aunt Caroline sent me a card. It said, "Your mother would be proud." I keep it on my desk. The house on Sycamore Street stood empty for 3 months while I decided what to do with it. I walked through it once, the day the title was finalized. I touched the walls my grandmother had painted. I stood in the kitchen where my mother taught me to make bread. I sat on the porch where my grandfather used to smoke his pipe on summer evenings. And then I locked the door and did not go back. I considered selling it. The market was good, and I could have used the money, but something about that felt wrong, like I would be erasing something that deserved to be remembered. Instead, I reached out to a local historical preservation group. The house was one of the oldest in the county, built in 1892 by a family of German immigrants who had helped establish the town. It had stories embedded in its bones, stories that had nothing to do with my father's spreadsheets or my siblings' plans. The preservation group was thrilled. They agreed to purchase the house at a fair price and restore it as a community landmark, a museum of local history, a place where school children could come and learn about the people who had lived there. And on the plaque outside the front door, my name is listed as the donor. Not Aaron's, not Julia's, not my father's, mine. Madeline Renner, steward of the Sycamore Street house, daughter of the woman who kept it standing. I used part of the sale money to pay off my debts. I used another part to take a trip, my first vacation in almost a decade. I went to the coast, rented a small cabin, and watched the ocean for a week without speaking to anyone. And I used the rest to start over. I am writing this from a small apartment in a city I will not name. I have a new job at a new firm. I have a cat named after my mother's middle name. I have a life that is finally, completely my own. My siblings and I do not speak. I do not know if we ever will. There are moments when I miss the idea of them, the fantasy of a family that supports each other, that shows up, that remembers, but I do not miss the reality. The reality was a ledger where I was always in the red, always giving more than I received, always hoping that someday the balance would shift. It never did. So I stopped waiting for someone else to shift it. I shifted it myself. If you are still watching this, thank you. Truly. I know this story is long and heavy, and probably touches places that hurt, but I hope you also feel what I felt when I walked out of that courthouse with the ruling in my hands. I do not know what will happen next. Maybe Aaron and Julia will find their way to some version of understanding. Maybe they will spend the rest of their lives believing I wronged them. Maybe someday, a niece or nephew I have never met will reach out and ask for my side of the story. I do not control any of that. I only control what I carry. and I have decided to set down everything that was never mine to lift. The house on Sycamore Street is a museum now. Families walk through it on Saturday mornings. Children press their faces to the windows. I used to clean. Docents tell the story of the German immigrants who built it, the generations who maintained it, the community that preserved it. And somewhere in that story, my name exists, not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, as a chapter. That is more than I ever expected, and it is exactly enough. If you are still here, I appreciate you more than I can say. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. Hit the like button if any part of this stayed with you, and if you want, leave a comment telling me which moment mattered most.